$20 million. 18 months. A public salary that never explains the jump. While families counted coins at gas stations, a rising political star watched money move through nonprofits, consulting firms, and a winery with a name too ironic to ignore. One investigator followed the numbers. He ended up dead. And the question Washington refused to ask was the one America couldn't unsee. Washington likes clean stories, especially when they come wrapped in virtue. It prefers heroes with neat biographies and villains that are easy to recognize. The problem begins when the numbers refuse to cooperate with the narrative. In this case, the numbers did not whisper. They screamed. 18 months is not a long time in politics, but it is an eternity in accounting. In that window, a sitting member of Congress moved from tens of thousands in personal debt to tens of millions in declared assets. The salary did not change, the public resume did not expand, and no conventional investment timeline could explain the leap. Every accountant knows what organic growth looks like. This did not look organic. While families across the Midwest were trimming grocery lists and skipping prescriptions, federal money flowed through programs designed to feed children. Those programs were written in the language of compassion, equity, and urgency. They were promoted as lifelines for communities Washington claimed to have ignored for decades. They were not marketed as investment vehicles. Yet behind the public speeches and carefully framed press appearances, a different picture began to emerge. Funds moved through nonprofits with vague missions and thinner documentation. Consulting firms appeared on paper without a corresponding physical footprint. A winery with an almost mocking name entered the ledger, reporting revenue that auditors struggled to reconcile with reality. The press, at least at first, did not linger on these details. The story did not fit the preferred mold. Questioning a progressive icon carried risk, and the modern media economy rewards certainty more than curiosity. Silence was easier than asking how the math actually worked. The silence broke not because of a headline, but because of an investigator. Michael Torres was not a celebrity whistleblower or a political operator. He was a mid-level IRS analyst who believed spreadsheets mattered, and that patterns told stories if you stayed patient long enough. He followed small irregularities in a federal meals program, the kind most people would dismiss as clerical noise. Those anomalies did not disappear when stacked together. They formed a structure, wide and deliberate, with money entering one side and vanishing on the other. Torres traced reimbursements, timestamps, and grant codes until the trail stopped looking accidental. It looked engineered. And engineering implies intent. On a rain-soaked night in Washington, Torres was found dead in a hotel room. The official report moved quickly, cleanly, and without curiosity. Stress, self-inflicted, case closed before sunrise. The system prefers explanations that allow it to move on, but details have a habit of resisting convenience. A puncture mark angled wrong. A laptop left open with an unfinished subject line. A USB drive still warm, still active, still pulsing with information someone did not want interrupted. Those details did not make headlines, but they reached the right eyes. Tulsi Gabbard did not walk into the story looking for a crusade. She had been in Congress long enough to recognize when an explanation was too tidy. When she saw the initial data pulled from Torres's work, the issue stopped being ideological. It became mechanical. The files on the drive were not dramatic. They were clean, professional, almost boring. Hundreds of transfers labeled as routine meal reimbursements, millions moving into a nonprofit with no functional storefront. That nonprofit traced back, through paperwork and tax IDs, to Rose Lake Capital, a firm tied directly to Ilhan Omar's household. The timing raised questions no press release could smooth over. Transfers aligned with votes. Votes aligned with legislative amendments. Amendments reduced oversight, not loudly, but surgically. Each step could be defended in isolation. Together, they formed a loop. Gabbard understood the danger of loops like that. They blur accountability while preserving plausible deniability. When laws are written to sound moral and technical at the same time, very few people read past the first paragraph. Oversight dies quietly. By the time the first leaks reached the public, the framing had already begun. Coincidence, misunderstanding, unfortunate optics. The story was treated as abstract, procedural, and easily dismissed. But online, a different reaction took hold. People were not debating ideology. They were asking a simpler question. How does a public servant get that rich that fast without access becoming part of the answer? That question does not belong to one party. As attention grew, so did resistance. Any attempt to scrutinize the money was reframed as an attack on identity. The language of accountability collided with the language of persecution. It was an effective shield because it forced critics to defend their motives instead of examining the data. Inside Washington, the tone shifted. Committees began requesting records. Staffers whispered instead of emailing. Servers hummed late into the night as documents were pulled, cross-referenced, and quietly duplicated. The city still looked calm, but the machinery underneath was accelerating. At the center of it all sat Ilhan Omar, a lawmaker whose personal story had become inseparable from her political brand. To supporters, she represented defiance and progress. To critics, she had become untouchable for reasons that had nothing to do with transparency. The confrontation ahead was never going to be about spreadsheets alone. It was about whether moral language could override arithmetic. It was about whether compassion could be used as camouflage. And it was about whether the system still remembered how to ask uncomfortable questions when the answers threatened a carefully curated narrative. By the time the hearing was scheduled, the outcome was no longer about one investigator or one lawmaker. It was about trust and how easily it could be monetized. Washington was about to watch two stories collide in public. One was built on rhetoric. The other was built on receipts. The opening days after Michael Torres's death did not feel like a scandal yet, at least not on the surface. Washington continued its rituals with mechanical precision. Hearings scheduled, fundraisers planned, press briefings delivered in the same practiced cadence. But inside offices where spreadsheets replaced slogans, the mood had shifted from indifference to unease. The numbers Torres left behind did not behave like rumors. They behaved like coordinates. Tulsi Gabbard understood early that this story would never move forward if it sounded ideological. Ideology invites debate, and debate creates fog. What she saw in the data was not political theory, but structure, a repeated set of financial movements that only made sense if someone had planned them in advance. Patterns do not care about party labels. The first step was confirming the scope. The transfers tied to the federal meals program were not occasional or irregular in timing. They arrived in steady waves, aligned with specific administrative approvals and budget expansions. Each wave followed the same path, from federal allocation to intermediary nonprofits, then onward to entities with private ties. That repetition stripped away the idea of accident. When the Somali Meals Foundation was placed under the microscope, the story deepened. On paper, it claimed extraordinary reach, serving tens of millions of meals in a remarkably short time. In practice, investigators struggled to locate physical evidence that matched the claims. Addresses led to empty storefronts, disconnected phone lines, and staff rosters that existed mostly in grant proposals. This gap between paperwork and reality was not new in federal programs, but the scale was. Inflated claims happen when oversight weakens, but rarely do they approach numbers that defy basic logistics. Feeding that many people would require supply chains, staffing, and infrastructure visible to anyone who looked. The absence of those elements raised a question that no press release could answer. As Gabbard traced the nonprofit's financial lineage, Rose Lake Capital emerged as a central node. Officially, it was a consulting and investment firm supporting community initiatives. Its filings suggested explosive growth and sophisticated deal flow. Its physical presence, however, did not match its financial posture. There was no bustling office, no identifiable workforce consistent with its reported revenue. What existed instead was a modest residential address and a digital paper trail heavy on movement and light on substance. This mismatch did not prove wrongdoing by itself, but it demanded explanation. No such explanation had been offered publicly. The timing of Rose Lake Capital's growth mirrored legislative activity closely. Each expansion of meal funding, each relaxation of oversight language, coincided with new surges in capital. Votes that were framed as humanitarian victories also functioned as financial accelerants. That overlap became impossible to ignore. Inside committee rooms, the phrase that kept resurfacing was not corruption, but architecture. The system appeared to have been designed to look benevolent while functioning permissively. Oversight was not eliminated outright. It was diffused, broken into smaller responsibilities that no single office fully owned. Accountability dissolved not with a bang, but with a shrug. This design protected more than one actor. It created a buffer zone where questions could be deflected and delays normalized. When journalists asked why documentation was thin, agencies pointed to nonprofit autonomy. When auditors questioned numbers, they were told to respect cultural sensitivity and urgency. Every challenge had a pre-written response. Publicly, Ilhan Omar continued to speak about hunger, inequality, and structural neglect. Her language resonated because it echoed real problems. Many of the communities referenced did struggle with food insecurity, and that reality made scrutiny feel uncomfortable. Few wanted to appear hostile to programs framed as moral imperatives. But discomfort is not a defense. The data did not accuse emotions, it accused arithmetic. If millions of meals were served, there should be millions of corresponding logistical traces. If money was spent properly, the trail should lead somewhere tangible. Instead, it looped back inward. When the Devil's Lie winery appeared in the financial records, even seasoned investigators paused. The name alone invited skepticism, but the filings demanded attention. The winery reported significant revenue despite limited public presence and ongoing disputes over inventory verification. In isolation, it looked like a struggling side business. In context, it looked like a convenient financial sponge. Transfers labeled as product purchases moved from nonprofit accounts into the winery's ledgers. The amounts were large enough to matter and frequent enough to suggest routine. Auditors searching for proof of product delivery found inconsistencies that could not be explained by seasonal fluctuation or startup inefficiency. The wine, at least on paper, existed more often than it could be found. This was the moment when internal discussions shifted tone. What had started as a question of oversight drifted toward the language of laundering, not in the cinematic sense, but in the technical one, where funds change shape and description without changing purpose. Money does not need to disappear to be misused. It only needs to arrive somewhere it was never meant to go. Gabbard was careful not to rush conclusions. Every document was cross-checked, every timestamp verified against public records. Legislative calendars were overlaid with transfer dates. The correlations did not weaken under scrutiny. They sharpened. As the committee prepared to formalize its inquiry, leaks began to surface. Some were strategic, others sloppy. Headlines hinted at irregularities without committing to specifics. Commentators argued over intent without ever seeing the underlying spreadsheets. The noise increased, exactly what well-designed systems rely on. Omar's public response followed a familiar script. She framed the inquiry as an attack on her identity and her constituents. She spoke of being targeted for her background, her faith, and her refusal to conform. For many supporters, the framing felt persuasive because it mirrored real experiences of bias. The danger lay in conflating scrutiny with prejudice. Behind the scenes, the inquiry expanded. Immigration records surfaced not as accusations, but as anomalies. A sponsorship file appeared to have been altered, then partially erased. Such deletions are rare and logged carefully. This one lacked routine justification. Financial transfers connected to individuals named in those files raised additional questions. Money moved quietly, without public explanation, between personal accounts and the same entities already under review. Each new discovery added another layer to a structure that was beginning to look deliberate, rather than incidental. The pressure inside Washington intensified. Lawmakers who had once dismissed the issue began requesting briefings. Staffers avoided putting sensitive thoughts in writing. Agencies that had once deferred responsibility started quietly preserving records. The instinct to protect institutions gave way to the instinct to protect oneself. By the time the hearing was scheduled, the country was already divided. To some, the inquiry represented overdue accountability. To others, it looked like a politically motivated spectacle. Both interpretations thrived in the absence of shared facts. The committee's challenge was to replace narrative with evidence. When the hearing finally opened, the room was packed not with certainty, but with expectation. Cameras lined the walls, broadcasting every pause and inflection. Ilhan Omar entered composed, projecting confidence shaped by years of public confrontation. Tulsi Gabbard arrived quieter, carrying binders instead of sound bites. The opening questions were measured. They focused on numbers, timelines, and process rather than motive. Omar responded with practiced fluency, emphasizing community investment and systemic neglect. Her answers were polished, emotionally resonant, and intentionally broad. Then the visuals appeared, images of claimed offices that did not exist, charts showing growth curves that defied industry norms, side-by-side timelines aligning votes with transfers. The room reacted not with outrage, but with a tightening silence. This silence marked a turning point. It was the sound of an audience realizing that two stories were unfolding simultaneously. One was rhetorical and familiar. The other was technical and relentless. Only one could be reconciled with the documents on the screen. As the session moved forward, it became clear that the conflict was not about belief, but about verification. Compassion could not substitute for receipts. Intentions could not erase transactions. And identity, however sincerely held, could not explain away math. By the end of the first day, Washington had not reached a verdict. It had reached a realization. This was no longer a debate about optics or ideology. It was an examination of how easily systems built for good could be redirected without immediate detection. The machinery that Michael Torres had traced in silence was now exposed to light. Whether that light would lead to accountability or collapse remained uncertain. What was clear was that the story had moved beyond whispers. It was now demanding answers. The second day of the hearing opened with less spectacle and more tension. The novelty had worn off, replaced by a quiet understanding that this was no longer symbolic theater. What unfolded now would determine whether the inquiry collapsed into rhetoric or hardened into consequence. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if everyone sensed that ambiguity was running out. Tulsi Gabbard resumed not with accusations, but with chronology. She walked the committee through a timeline that stitched legislation, agency guidance, and financial movement into a single sequence. Each step by itself could be defended as routine governance. Taken together, the sequence suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The committee examined how oversight language in the Meals Act had been adjusted. The changes were not sweeping, and that was precisely the point. Oversight was not eliminated, it was diluted, distributed across offices with overlapping authority and minimal enforcement power. Responsibility became so fragmented that no single agency owned failure. Witnesses from federal departments described confusion rather than resistance. They spoke about pressure to move funds quickly and avoid creating bottlenecks. No one recalled explicit instructions to ignore fraud, only repeated reminders not to slow delivery. Speed, in this environment, became a substitute for scrutiny. Gabbard emphasized that urgency is not a license to suspend verification. Emergency programs still require traceability. When verification disappears entirely, emergency becomes a permanent loophole. The committee's concern was not generosity, but the absence of brakes. Attention then shifted back to the nonprofits at the center of the transfers. Feeding Our Future and its affiliates reported output so large that even generous estimates strained plausibility. Investigators described attempting to verify meal counts through suppliers, transport records, and staffing logs. What they found were gaps wide enough to swallow entire months. The phrase that kept resurfacing was phantom volume, meals recorded on paper that never left a kitchen, invoices that referenced events no one remembered hosting, vendor lists populated with entities that dissolved as soon as questions were asked. The paperwork existed, but the physical reality did not. Ilhan Omar's responses remained consistent. She argued that large programs inevitably contain inefficiencies. She pointed to national examples where waste went unpunished. Her message was that singling out one network risked reinforcing selective enforcement. The subtext was clear. If everyone is imperfect, why focus here? The committee answered with scale. This was not marginal inefficiency, but exponential distortion. The difference between minor waste and systemic fabrication is measured not in percentages, but in orders of magnitude. No comparable case had produced similar claims without immediate intervention. As the hearing progressed, the Devil's Lie winery returned to the spotlight. Financial analysts testified about how businesses can be used as financial buffers without necessarily operating as traditional enterprises. Revenue can be claimed without corresponding sales, particularly when counterparties are friendly or opaque. It is not dramatic, but it is effective. The committee avoided definitive conclusions about intent. Instead, it focused on compatibility. Could a winery accused in separate proceedings of overstated sales credibly receive multi-million-dollar transfers for product purchases from a nonprofit funded by federal meal programs? The absence of clear delivery records made compatibility difficult to argue. Emails were introduced carefully, contextualized rather than sensationalized. They showed discussions about managing attention, minimizing noise, and keeping documentation aligned. None explicitly ordered misconduct. All suggested awareness of scrutiny risk. In regulatory language, awareness matters. The press gallery reacted not with gasps, but with calculation. Clips were being framed even as testimony continued. Phrases were lifted and stripped of nuance. The narrative battle ran parallel to the evidentiary one, and both sides understood which would travel faster. Outside the chamber, political responses hardened. Supporters framed the inquiry as persecution masquerading as oversight. Critics framed it as long-delayed accountability. The middle ground shrank, leaving little room for uncertainty. Yet uncertainty was exactly where the committee insisted on operating. The third thread emerged reluctantly: immigration records. Gabbard made clear that the committee was not adjudicating identity or belonging. It was examining documentation consistency. In government systems, inconsistencies matter because benefits and statuses are assigned based on representations. Records showed sponsorship classifications that later conflicted with biological relationships suggested by forensic testing presented to the committee. The testimony was narrow, technical, and cautious. It avoided conclusions, emphasizing only that the representations could not all be true simultaneously. Deletion logs raised further questions. Federal records are rarely erased without trace. When they are, reasons are documented. In this case, the rationale was unclear. That lack of clarity did not prove wrongdoing, but it demanded explanation. No satisfactory explanation was offered during the session. Financial transfers between individuals named in those records and entities already under review added complexity. The committee resisted framing these movements as payoff or reward. Instead, it described them as reinforcing links in a network already under scrutiny. Networks, once mapped, tell their own stories. As hours passed, Omar's posture shifted. The confident rhythm of her responses slowed. Her arguments remained coherent but less expansive. She returned repeatedly to themes of discrimination and selective outrage. The committee acknowledged those realities while insisting they were not substitutes for accounting. The hearing did not end with a dramatic declaration. It ended with referrals. Documents were forwarded to agencies equipped to evaluate criminal exposure. The committee's role was framed as preliminary, not prosecutorial. This distinction mattered legally and politically. In the days that followed, the Capitol reacted the way it always does. Anonymous sources spoke to reporters. Allies issued statements of solidarity. Opponents demanded resignations. None of this changed the documents now circulating beyond the committee's control. Investigators expanded their scope. The same nonprofit network appeared in other funding streams, smaller but similarly structured. The architecture was not isolated to one program. It was modular, adaptable, and difficult to dismantle without sustained attention. Unmarked vehicles arriving at party headquarters became symbols rather than conclusions. Warrants were executed quietly. Servers were cataloged and removed. Officials stressed routine procedure. Routine, however, rarely attracts cameras unless something larger is at stake. The White House addressed the moment with restraint. The language emphasized process and rule of law. There were no names, no predictions. The message was simple. Oversight applies universally, or it means nothing. That framing sought to cool rather than inflame. For the public, the story resisted closure. Some saw confirmation of long-held suspicions about political hypocrisy. Others saw proof that reformers are punished for challenging entrenched systems. Both interpretations fed existing beliefs. Neither resolved the arithmetic. What remained undeniable was the lesson about systems. Programs designed with moral urgency can be manipulated if safeguards are framed as obstacles rather than protections. Language can disarm skepticism faster than policy can enforce discipline. That vulnerability does not belong to one ideology. Michael Torres's name resurfaced occasionally, usually at the margins. His work had triggered a chain reaction he never saw completed. The documents he assembled did not accuse, they revealed. In that sense, they outlived him. As the main body of the inquiry closed, Washington did not collapse or reform overnight. It adjusted, as it always does. Careers paused, alliances shifted, and narratives evolved. The machinery kept moving, but with more eyes watching its gears. The unresolved question was not whether one lawmaker would survive politically. It was whether the system had learned anything durable. Oversight, once politicized, is hard to reclaim as neutral. Yet without it, every noble program becomes a potential conduit. The main body of this story does not end with a verdict. It ends with exposure, with a demonstration of how easily trust can be converted into capital when scrutiny is discouraged, and with a reminder that the most dangerous corruption is the kind that insists it is immune to questioning. What remains after the hearings is not a clean ending, but an exposed framework. The story never resolved into a single villain or a single heroic act, because systems rarely fail that way. They fail through permission, through silence, through habits that turn oversight into inconvenience and narrative into shield. What unfolded was not a morality play, but a stress test of whether modern governance can still distinguish between compassion and camouflage. The testimony did not deliver a final moral verdict, and that restraint matters. Democracies are not strengthened by theatrical certainty. They are strengthened by process that survives pressure from every direction. The danger revealed here was not that a program designed to help people could be abused. That truth is as old as public spending itself. The danger was how easily abuse could be defended once it learned the right language. Throughout the inquiry, the same tension surfaced again and again. Numbers were presented, and stories rose to meet them. Documents appeared, and identities were invoked in response. Neither side denied the existence of need. Neither side denied the reality of inequality. The conflict lived in the space between intention and execution, where accountability is supposed to operate without prejudice or favoritism. The architecture exposed was not accidental. It was built piece by piece, using rules that sounded reasonable and reforms that felt humane. Oversight was not eliminated because that would have drawn attention. It was softened, distributed, and delayed until responsibility blurred. In that blur, money did what money always does when it senses freedom. It moved. This is the uncomfortable truth few want to confront. Corruption does not always announce itself with greed. Sometimes it introduces itself as urgency. Sometimes it wears the vocabulary of justice so convincingly that questioning it feels cruel. That is precisely why it works. When scrutiny is framed as hostility, accountability becomes optional. The press played its familiar role, oscillating between amplification and avoidance. Early silence gave way to selective outrage, often guided more by audience alignment than by evidentiary weight. In that environment, facts struggled to travel without being reshaped. The result was not clarity, but polarization masquerading as understanding. For those watching outside Washington, the hearings likely felt less like revelation and more like confirmation. Many had already concluded that systems favor those who know how to navigate them. What shocked some was not that funds were misused, but how elaborate and normalized the pathways appeared. This was not a smash and grab. It was a method. The most revealing aspect of the proceedings was not any single document or testimony. It was the reaction to scrutiny itself. Each time a question was asked, The response shifted the frame away from behavior and toward identity. That tactic was powerful because it exploited real histories of discrimination. It was dangerous because it implied that some individuals or groups should be insulated from examination altogether. A system that cannot question itself evenly does not protect justice. It replaces it with hierarchy. The moment accountability depends on who you are rather than what you did, governance becomes symbolic rather than functional. That shift does not help marginalized communities. It traps them inside narratives that excuse exploitation instead of preventing it. At the same time, those who demanded accountability were not immune from scrutiny either. Selective enforcement corrodes legitimacy just as effectively as neglect. If outrage only appears when the target belongs to the opposing tribe, then oversight becomes another weapon rather than a safeguard. That lesson applies regardless of ideology. What the hearings ultimately demonstrated was a collision between two forms of trust. One is emotional, built on shared stories and lived experience. The other is procedural, built on records, audits, and verification. A healthy society needs both. When one is allowed to cancel out the other, imbalance follows. The investigators did not claim that every nonprofit was fraudulent or that every reform was a sham. They did not argue that compassion itself is suspect. Their argument was narrower and more unsettling. When compassion is used as a substitute for transparency, it becomes indistinguishable from manipulation. Good intentions do not exempt bad mechanisms. The absence of a final judgment is not a failure of the process. It is a reflection of reality. Accountability does not always arrive neatly packaged. It often arrives fragmented, contested, and incomplete. What matters is whether the questions raised are allowed to persist beyond the news cycle. There is a temptation, after moments like this, to retreat into certainty, to declare the system irredeemable, or to dismiss the entire episode as partisan theater. Both responses offer comfort without responsibility. Neither addresses the structural weaknesses laid bare. The more difficult response is to sit with discomfort, to accept that programs we support can be misused, to accept that people we admire can make choices that deserve scrutiny, to accept that skepticism is not betrayal, and that oversight is not cruelty. That posture requires maturity from citizens and restraint from leaders. This story also exposes a quieter risk. When allegations become entertainment, substance dissolves. When hearings are reduced to clips and slogans, the public loses access to nuance. Accountability cannot survive in an environment where attention is measured only in outrage. What happens next will depend less on verdicts and more on habits. Will oversight be strengthened or merely relabeled? Will transparency be applied consistently or selectively? Will moral language continue to function as insulation rather than invitation to scrutiny? These are not questions for one committee or one election cycle. The architecture uncovered here did not arise overnight. It grew in spaces where urgency trumped verification and where asking hard questions carried social cost. Dismantling such architecture requires more than investigations. It requires cultural change within institutions and among the public they serve. The most dangerous outcome would be to learn nothing, to treat this episode as an anomaly rather than a warning. Systems that survive without reform rarely become more ethical on their own. They become more sophisticated. In the end, the unresolved tension remains. If accountability is conditional, who decides the conditions? If compassion exempts power from scrutiny, who protects the people those programs are meant to serve? And if questioning the flow of public money is framed as an attack, how long before oversight disappears entirely? So the story does not close with certainty, but with a challenge. Not to one party or one ideology, but to anyone who claims to care about justice, governance, and trust. When noble language and troubling numbers collide, which one deserves your loyalty?